You've seen them. The rows of motorhomes parked in the far corner of the Walmart lot, curtains drawn, a little frost on the inside of the glass. People with jobs, people who owned a home once, now living in a box on wheels because the house got too dear to hold on to. Here is what I found after months of digging. A single generation of Canadians lived in homes smaller than that RV, kept them warmer than your house is right now, and owed almost nothing to anybody. And I found out exactly how they did it, buried in a government bulletin I don't think anyone had opened in 50 years. The trail ended in a document from 1917. I'll walk you through every step, because the last piece of it is something you can do this weekend, in the home you already have, whether you own it or rent it. Let me start where I ended up, because that's where the shock hit me. It was a Tuesday afternoon, late winter, and I was sitting in the reading room of a provincial archive with gray light coming through the window, and my reading glasses fogged up from the radiator. I had a thin, brittle pamphlet in front of me, the kind of thing with a stapled cardboard cover gone soft at the corners, and on page 4 there was a drawing, a wooden box packed with hay, a pot nestled inside it, and a caption that made me sit back in my chair. It claimed a family could cook a full pot of stew, beans, or porridge using barely any fuel at all. Not a wood stove burning all day. Not a hydro bill that doubles in January. Almost nothing. I read it 3 times. I thought it had to be a mistake or some old wives' tale. It wasn't. And by the time I understood it, I was a little angry that nobody had ever told me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the question that started all of this, because you've probably asked it yourself without saying it out loud. How did our parents and grandparents get by on so little? I don't mean scraping by, miserable and cold. I mean a man with one income, a wife at home, 4 or 5 kids, and somehow a paid-off house by the time he was 50. My own father did it on a mechanic's wage. And the more I looked at what it costs to simply exist in this country today, the more that math stopped making sense to me. Something had changed. Not just prices. Something in the way we live had been quietly swapped out for something more expensive, and nobody sent us a memo. So a couple of winters ago, I started pulling on the thread. I started with the RVs, honestly. I wanted to know why so many working Canadians were ending up in them, and the numbers I found were worse than I expected. The average price of a home in this country climbed past the $700,000 mark. In some cities, a modest bungalow that sold for $11,000 in 1960 now trades for well over $1 million. Wages did not keep up, not even close. A house that once took about 2 years of a single income to pay for now takes the better part of a working lifetime, if you can manage it at all. And here's the first thing that stopped me cold. The homes we're all fighting over are enormous compared to what people used to live in. The average new Canadian house today runs close to 2,000 square feet. Back in the 1940s and 50s, a family of 6 raised their children in a house half that size, sometimes less. So I asked myself a simple question. What did those small houses actually look like, and how much did they really cost? That question led me to the first real clue. In 1941, in the middle of the war, the federal government set up something called Wartime Housing Limited. There was a desperate shortage of homes for workers pouring into the factory towns, and rather than wring their hands about it, they just built small, tidy, 1.5-story houses. People took to calling them strawberry box houses because that's what they looked like, a little square box with a peaked roof. Plain, honest, warm, and here is the number that made me put my coffee down. Those houses were built for somewhere around $1,000 to $2,500 each. Tens of thousands of them went up across the country from Nova Scotia to British Columbia. Many of them are still standing today, still lived in, and I'd bet you've driven past 100 of them without knowing what you were looking at. Now, $1,000 in 1941 is not $1,000 today, I understand that. But even adjusted, these homes were a fraction of what we pay, and they were built to be paid off, not to be a lifelong debt sentence. So a family got a solid little house they could actually afford. That part of the mystery, I felt like I'd cracked. But it opened up a much bigger question. Because a cheap house is only cheap to buy. What about the cost of living in it? Through a Canadian winter, year after year, a house that's cheap to buy but ruins you to heat isn't cheap at all. And I knew, from my own hydro bills, that heating is where they get you. So how did those little houses stay warm without an enormous fuel bill? I grew up thinking old houses were drafty and miserable. Everybody says it. Grandma's house was freezing, you'd hear people laugh. But that didn't match what I was finding in the old records. And it didn't match what an old-timer told me either. Let me tell you about him, because he changed how I saw this whole thing. His name was Elmer, and I met him purely by accident. I'd stopped at a little coffee shop outside Peterborough while I was chasing down some old farm records, and I got to talking with a fellow at the next table, must have been close to 90, sharp as a tack. When I told him what I was researching, he laughed and said, "Huh, son, my mother kept a house warm through the Depression with a stove the size of a bread box, and she never once complained about the cold." I asked him how, and what he told me, I later found written down almost word for word in a Dominion Experimental Farms bulletin from the early 1900s. They banked the house. Now, if you didn't grow up rural, you've probably never heard that phrase, banking the house. It means that every fall, before the ground froze hard, the family would pile material around the entire base of the house, all along the foundation, right up against the walls. Soil, straw, fallen leaves, manure, out on the farms. Later, once the snow came, they'd bank the snow up too, right against the skirting. It sounds almost too simple to matter. That's what I thought. A pile of leaves against the wall? Come on. But here's the physics of it. And this is what Elmer's mother understood in her bones. The coldest, leakiest part of most houses is down low, where the floor meets the foundation. That's where the frost drives in. That's where the wind finds every crack in the sill. By packing a thick, dead-air blanket of straw and earth and snow around that whole base, they cut the windstone dead and they stopped the cold from creeping up through the floor. A banked house could stay 10-15 degrees warmer down at floor level than a bare one, with no extra fuel burned at all. Snow, believe it or not, is a tremendous insulator. It's mostly trapped air. The Inuit have known this for thousands of years, building shelters out of the very stuff that's trying to kill you. Our settlers learned it too, and they used it on purpose, every single winter. So that's how the little house stayed warm without a monster of a furnace. They sealed the bottom, they burned small, and they went to bed warm. I sat with that for a while, feeling pretty satisfied. Cheap house, cheap to heat. Mystery solved, I figured. Except it wasn't, because a nagging little question kept poking at me. If this stuff worked so well, and cost so little, and everybody's grandmother knew it, then where did it go? Why did I, a grown Canadian man in his late 50s, have to dig through a dusty archive to find out something my own great-grandparents did without thinking? Somebody, somewhere, decided we didn't need to know this anymore. And once I started asking who, and why, the whole thing turned from a nice bit of nostalgia into something that genuinely made my blood boil. Here's what I pieced together, and I want you to follow it, because it explains the RVs in that parking lot better than any news story I've ever seen. After the war, in 1946, the government created the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation. On the face of it, a good thing. It helped returning soldiers and young families get into homes. But it also did something else. It plugged the Canadian family, permanently, into the mortgage system. The long amortization, the 25 and 30-year loan, the idea that a house isn't something you build cheap and pay off fast, but something you borrow enormous sums against for most of your adult life. And a funny thing happens when a house becomes a financial product instead of a shelter. Bigger is better. Bigger house, bigger loan, bigger interest, bigger everything. There is no money to be made off a strawberry box house that a man pays off in 8 years. There is a fortune to be made off a 2,000 square foot house that a couple pays interest on until they're gray. So the little house didn't just fall out of fashion. It was made to look like failure. Living small became something to be ashamed of. Living cheap became something poor people did. And the skills that made small living comfortable, the banking, the root cellars, the fireless cooking I'll get to in a minute, all of it got quietly relabeled as backward, as peasant stuff, as something you'd only do if you couldn't afford better. Nobody outlawed banking your house. They did something cleverer. They made you feel foolish for wanting to. And the utilities were only too happy to help. A house that leans on the grid for every scrap of heat and every pot of soup is a customer for life. Self-reliance is bad for business. A family that can keep half its warmth with a pile of straw and snow is a family that isn't paying full price for gas and hydro. There's no line item on your bill for the money you didn't have to spend, and there's no salesman who's going to teach you how to spend less with him. That's the villain here, and it isn't one man in a black hat. It's a whole system that profits, quietly and enormously, from you forgetting things your grandmother knew for free. Now, I promised you this ends with something you can actually use in the home you've got right now. And I know exactly what some of you are thinking. That's fine for a farmhouse. That's fine if you've got acres and a barn. But I live in a rental. I live in a condo. I live in a 50-year-old house I can't tear apart. This isn't for me. That's the door I walk through next, and that's where the trail got strange. If the methods, the history, and the forgotten tricks I've been digging up are the kind of thing you want more of, I put a great deal of what I've found into a digital book. It's available in 3 editions: Canadian Edge, Deep Canadian, and Canadian Complete, depending on how deep you want to go. You'll find the link in the description below. It's the kind of reading you do once and keep coming back to, because it's not theory, it's the real documented knowledge that a whole country used to live by and was quietly talked out of. But let me get back to that old-timer, because what he told me changes everything about how you think of winter in this country. I want to talk to you especially, because this next part was made for you, and it needs no contractor, no permit, no landlord's permission, and almost no money. Let's start with the banking, because you can absolutely do a version of it. Even in town, even in a rental. You don't need manure, and you don't need a farm. What you need is to seal that cold bottom edge of your living space, the same principle Elmer's mother used. Go outside this fall and look at the base of your walls, where the siding meets the ground, or where your foundation shows. Every gap down there is a river of cold air pouring into your floors. On the prairies, folks still do this with straw bales laid end to end along the north and west walls of the house, tight against the wall, right where the wind bites hardest. A dozen bales might run you $30 or $40, and you can lift them away in spring and use the straw in the garden. No damage, no permit, nobody's business but yours. If you're in an apartment and you can't touch the outside of the building, you do the same thing on the inside, at the coldest surfaces. That old window that fogs and frosts and leaks cold onto your feet, in the old days they'd tack a second layer over it, an inside storm, and trap a cushion of dead air between. You can buy a clear film kit at any hardware store for a few dollars a window, shrink it tight with a hairdryer, and you've just recreated a 100-year-old trick that can cut the heat loss through that glass by a good half. I did 3 windows in my own back room in about 20 minutes. And here's one Elmer swore by, and it goes back centuries in the old country. Heavy curtains, floor to ceiling, close the moment the sun goes down, not those thin decorative things. Thick, lined, heavy fabric, the heavier the better, hung so they seal at the top and puddle a little on the floor at the bottom. A window is a hole in your wall stuffed with a thin sheet of glass. At night, in January, it's dumping your heat straight outside. A heavy curtain, sealed top and bottom, traps a wall of still air against that cold glass and keeps your heat in the room where you paid to make it. People used to hang quilts over the doors and windows on the coldest nights and thought nothing of it. We call it decorating. They called it survival. Do those 3 things. Seal the base, film the windows, hang heavy curtains and close them at dusk, and you will feel the difference in the first cold snap. You'll feel it in your feet first. And come spring, you'll see it on the bill. But warmth was only half of it. Because there's one more cost that quietly drains a household every single day, And it's the one I saw in that brittle little pamphlet on the archive table. It's the reason I started this whole story at the end. Cooking. Think about how much fuel it takes to cook the way we cook now. A pot of beans, an hour and a half on the burner. A stew, 2-3 hours simmering. A roast, an oven blasting away half the afternoon. Every minute of that is fuel burning, hydro spinning, money leaving your pocket. And most of that heat isn't even doing anything. Once a pot of food reaches a boil, it does not need to keep boiling. It just needs to stay hot. But we stand there feeding the flame anyway, hour after hour, because that's how we were taught. Our great-grandparents figured out a better way, and they had it working long before they could explain the science of it. This is where the trail ended. And this is the piece I've been holding back, because it's the one that genuinely changed how I cook. That pamphlet in the archive was tied to the work of the Canada Food Board, which was set up around 1917 and 1918 during the First World War, when fuel and food were desperately short and every scrap had to be stretched. The home economics women, trained at places like the MacDonald Institute in Guelph, which had been teaching domestic science since 1903, spread the method across the country in bulletins and demonstrations. They called it the fireless cooker. Some folks called it a haybox. And once you understand it, you'll wonder why every kitchen in Canada doesn't still have one. Here is the whole secret. You take your pot of food, your stew, your beans, your oatmeal, your soup, and you bring it to a hard, rolling boil on the stove for a few minutes. Just a few. Then you take the whole pot, lid on tight, and you bury it in a box packed full of insulation. Hay, in the old days, wool blankets, crumpled newspaper, an old sleeping bag, towels, whatever traps air, works just fine today. You pack it in so the pot is completely surrounded, top and bottom and all around, close the box, and you walk away, and the food keeps cooking. It cooks itself. The heat you already put in has nowhere to escape, so the pot stays up around the cooking temperature for hours. A pot of beans that would need 3 hours on the stove will finish, tender and perfect, in a well-packed box with the burner off the entire time. Dried beans, tough cuts of meat, whole grains, porridge, all the cheap, filling, humble foods, they're exactly the ones this method does best. I built one myself, because I flat out didn't believe it. I took a plain cardboard box, lined it with an old wool blanket and a nest of crumpled newspaper, made a well in the middle for my pot. I brought a pot of split pea soup to a boil for 5 minutes, buried it, and left it. Went out to run errands like Elmer's mother would have. Came back 3 hours later, pulled the lid off, and the soup was steaming hot and cooked right through. 5 minutes of gas instead of 2 hours. Huh! I stood in my own kitchen and laughed out loud. The Canada Food Board estimated these fireless cookers could save the great majority of the fuel a family burned to cook a meal. Some of their figures ran as high as 3/4, upwards of 80% of the cooking fuel, gone, saved, kept in your pocket. During the war, they promoted it as patriotic, a way to leave more coal and gas for the troops. But the country folk kept using it long after the war, quietly, because it simply worked, and because it also meant a woman didn't have to stand over a hot stove all day in July. And here is the part that ties it all back to those RVs in the parking lot. This costs almost nothing to build. It needs no electricity to run. It works in a tiny space. It works in a house, an apartment, a cabin, and yes, it works in a motorhome. The very people we pity in that parking lot could feed themselves for pennies with a trick that a Canadian government bulletin was teaching for free more than 100 years ago. The knowledge that would rescue them was printed, distributed, proven, and then allowed to vanish, because there is no profit in a pot that cooks itself with the stove turned off. That's what got me. Not that we lost this, that we were made to lose it, gently, while being sold something more expensive to replace it. So let me hand it all back to you, plainly, so you can start this weekend. To build the fireless cooker, you need a box with a lid, a cardboard box works, a wooden one lasts longer, a picnic cooler is even better because it's already insulated. Line it thick with wool, old blankets, towels, crumpled newspaper, anything that traps air. Leave a nest in the middle exactly the size of your pot. Bring your food to a full boil for 5 to 10 minutes, longer for big, tough cuts of meat. Get it good and hot all the way through. Lid on tight. Set it in the nest and pack insulation over the top too, so it's surrounded on every side. Close the box, then leave it alone for anywhere from 2 to 6 hours depending on what you're making. That's it. Beans, stews, soups, oatmeal you start the night before and wake up to hot, whole grains, tough, cheap roasts turned tender. The cheaper the food, the better it works. And while your supper cooks itself, you go outside and bank the base of your walls against the coming cold, and you close those heavy curtains at dusk, and you feel your whole home get quieter and cheaper and more yours. None of this needs a bank. None of it needs the grid at full tilt. None of it needs $1 going to anybody who'd rather you stayed dependent. That's the thing they took from us. Not money, exactly. They took the knowledge that we could do it ourselves. They convinced a whole country that comfort has to be purchased, month after month, forever, and that anyone living small and warm and debt-free was somehow doing it wrong, and the proof that it was a lie was sitting in a stapled cardboard pamphlet in an archive, gathering dust, waiting for somebody stubborn enough to go looking. You are that kind of person. I know you are, because you're still here, at the end of a long story about hay and snow and old boxes, when you could have scrolled past to something easier. You're the kind of Canadian who always suspected that the way we're told to live, expensive, borrowed, plugged into everything, wasn't the only way, and maybe wasn't even a good way. You were right. It was a choice, made for you, by people who profited from the choosing. And now you can choose differently, starting this weekend, in the home you already have. So let me ask you something, and I really do want you to answer this one. Did anyone in your family ever bank the house for winter, or pile the snow up against the walls, or use some trick like that fireless cooker that the rest of us forgot? Tell me about it in the comments. Tell me where they lived and what they did. I read every single one. And honestly, some of the best things I've learned came from folks like you, writing in with what their grandmothers did. Don't keep it to yourself. Leave a comment and put it down where the rest of us can learn from it too. And if you feel what I feel, that a lot of good, plain, useful Canadian knowledge got buried on purpose so somebody else could sell it back to us, then come along with me. Subscribe and stand with the people who are digging it all back up, one forgotten trick at a time. We're not building an audience here, we're recovering an inheritance. Because the next trail I'm following is a strange one. It's about how families in the coldest parts of this country kept a winter's worth of vegetables from freezing without any electricity at all, in a little chamber dug into the ground, and about one village in Newfoundland that has more of these hidden underground rooms than anywhere else on Earth. Some of them were built before Confederation, and they still work perfectly today. I found out how they did it, and how you can do a small version of it under your own house. But that, my friend, is a story for next time. You've stayed right to the end, so here's what comes next. This video gave the overview, but inside the Northern Ways circle I've laid out the full wartime strawberry box house blueprint, picking up exactly where I stopped. Ask me your own questions, and a real person, me, answers you myself. You'd be joining practical folks like you. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime with one click. Come join me.